Beliefs about vampires, werewolves, witches, and wizards are widespread.
Exactly what is a serial killer?
Our house was 2 rooms, and there was 7 of us.
He held the bat like this.
That's why I have characters who sort of expose themselves.
And everybody always say, Coach Carter, Samuel Jackson is taller than you. I said, I know, but I think I'm better looking.
Okay, in case you were wondering what I was waiting for, that was a television timeout. My name is Bill Robinson. I'm head of the Department of History and Political Science, and I'm very happy to welcome you, whether you are here in the room or watching the live stream, to this year's Veterans Day lecture. I'm especially excited about this one because, you know, Southeastern has been selected for a number of years as a military-friendly university. We also house ROTC in the Department of History and Political Science, and we've always put a premium on military history, but today is really something special. Dr. Samantha Cavell is going to be telling you about this project here, the Veterans of Recent Wars project, and she's got some very special guests here to help her do that. And I only want to add to that that this is the last of the fall fanfare lectures, but we will be back in the spring with more stuff, so be watching for us. Dr. Cavell is our military historian, has a Ph.D. from the University of Exeter, and I'm going to limit my introduction to that and leave more time for her and our guests to talk. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Samantha Cavell.
Thank you, Dr. Robertson. I appreciate the introduction. And thank you all for coming here to help us commemorate this Veterans Day 2020. And to start, I would like to ask you all a question, which is, who is it that you think of on Veterans Day? Which veterans come to mind when it's time to remember and give thanks? Certainly, the doughboys of World War I, they gave us the moment, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, commemorating the armistice, which was the end of the Great War. In 1947, the day was renamed to celebrate those who had just returned from war in Europe and the Pacific, and the name change to Veterans Day was made official in 1954. These indelible images of GIs landing at Omaha Beach on D-Day, the Marines raising a flag at Iwo Jima, sailors manning the decks of ships at Midway, and the airmen who flew missions from which they never returned. These are all images that stick fast in our minds. But since World War II, we've engaged in conflicts in Korea, Vietnam, Latin America, Bosnia, Somalia, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Iraq again. And when we talk of just the war on terrorism, which began after 9/11, we're talking of the longest continuous conflict in American history, going on 19 years now. And the men and women who've served in these more recent conflicts receive very little recognition on Veterans Day, or most other days for that matter. Sure, we're all very good at thanking those in uniform for their service, but what do we say after that? What do we know about the wars they've been fighting, or the scope of their experiences in those conflicts? What do we know of the sacrifices that the veterans of the last 20 years have had to make in order to keep us safe? Sometimes it's hard to know what to say beyond thank you for your service. A lack of knowledge about the conflict or the place where it was fought, a fear of saying the wrong thing or of saying something that might trigger bad memories, all of these contribute to something that the Department of Defense calls the military-civilian divide. It is defined, according to a report that came out in 2019, as characterized by misperceptions, a lack of knowledge, and an inability to identify with those who serve. And the gulf seems to widen every year as fewer people, as a percentage of the population, sign up for military service. Think about this. In World War II, nearly 10% of the population was in uniform. Every American knew someone, a family member or a friend who was serving, and we all experienced the war at home through rationing and blackouts and through our almost universal contributions to the arsenal of democracy. Today, about 0.5% of the population serves, and at home we are far less invested in the ongoing and seemingly endless wars which don't even draw enough attention to make the news anymore. So it's not surprising that many of our current veterans feel forgotten and shut out of civilian life. The question is, how do we begin to bridge that divide and reconnect civilians and veterans in our local communities? Well, one answer, we hope, lies in the Veterans of Recent Wars project, started here at Southeastern in December of 2019. And when complete, it will be an online oral history archive of local veteran stories from recent conflicts, mainly from Iraq and Afghanistan, but also going back to conflicts in Somalia, Bosnia, Panama, Grenada, and even a few from Vietnam. The project's mission is twofold. First, we want to provide an outlet for veterans, many of whom feel overlooked, a forum in which they can tell their stories and be heard. The second objective is to present these stories in an online website format with searchable text transcripts of the interviews so that everyone from academic researchers to the general public can easily access the archive material. The focus is on findability of people, names, places, dates, events that makes the information instantly available. Each veteran's story, their piece of the war, will be presented in context of the larger conflict in which they participated, with summaries of the action, timelines, and map references linked to each individual story. The goal is to make the veteran's experience visible, accessible, and understandable to a general audience. At the same time, all veterans' interviews are based on a uniform framework of questions to allow for the creation of databases, making the site useful to academics from a wide range of disciplines. Ultimately, we hope that this will start a conversation by giving civilians the information that they need to begin to understand the contributions of our recent servicemen and women. To date, more than 30 interviews have been conducted, thanks largely to the work of veteran and now Southeastern graduate, Sergeant First Class Cody Standridge, who's here with us today. Cody, would you like to come up and take a seat? His ongoing service with the Louisiana Army National Guard saw him shipped out to Iraq in 2007. And Sergeant Standridge's unique role was as a chaplain assistant. This meant that he was both a combat soldier and a multi-denominational counselor at Camp Liberty, Victory Base Compound in Baghdad, Iraq. When Sergeant Standridge and I started talking about this project, neither of us knew what the response from veterans would be. Would anyone want to come and share their stories and share what might, in many cases, be traumatic experiences? Would they want to go public? Would they trust us with their stories? The response, however, has been overwhelming, with many veterans eager to participate in the project. And based on the interviews conducted so far, it is clear that our men and women in uniform, our local people, have remarkable stories to tell and ones that they want to share. Sometimes, honestly, these stories shock, sometimes they amaze, and always they remind us that military service involves sacrifice. Sacrifice of family, of friends, and of self. To help us understand that commitment, Sergeant Standridge and Lieutenant Colonel Ebony Carter. Colonel Carter, would you like to come up to the stage? Also of the Louisiana Army National Guard, who served in Baghdad starting in 2009, have agreed to come here today and represent the voices of the servicemen and women who've shared their stories so far with the project. The best way to demonstrate what the Veterans of Recent Wars project is all about is to offer excerpts taken from a few of the interviews that have been conducted over the last 9 months, which cover a diverse range of experiences on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan. Yet within the different experiences, certain common themes have emerged which shed light on motivations, the actions undertaken, and the long-term consequences of serving in the modern military. As a way of honoring their service today, we'd like to share a few small pieces of these stories, give you a glimpse into the lives of just some of the veterans who contributed to the project. One of the first questions we ask everyone who participates is, why did you join up? And perhaps unsurprisingly, the impact of 9/11 was, for many of this generation, a key motivator. The call to patriotic duty spurred the majority of veterans to sign up, and it's, I think, something that connects these veterans to veteran volunteers of just about all our nation's conflicts. One of the veterans who spoke to us, Lieutenant Colonel and now State Chaplain Paige Brooks of the 141st Field Artillery of the Louisiana National Guard, felt that signing up was a chance to serve both a patriotic duty and his fellow soldiers.
I joined right after 9/11. During my time in college, I had felt like I wanted to pursue something in the military. And of course, being a chaplain, having the call of God in my life to serve the ministry, I eventually decided to join as a chaplain because I felt that it was a good way to be able to combine both the ministry calling as well as interest in military science and military operations. I had kind of put the idea away for a little while, but then after 9/11 happened, I felt like I should be there, be able to help to minister to soldiers.
Even before 9/11, with the start of Operation Desert Storm in Iraq in 1990, patriotic duty was foremost in the mind of Marine Sergeant Jared Nolan.
One of the other reasons I joined the Marine Corps was the start of Desert Storm. At first I was like, let's go. I was pretty excited about deploying, but when I tell people who are not in the military that, they don't understand. After I got out of the Marine Corps, I joined the Guard and mobilized to Kandahar, Afghanistan in 2002. My motivation, my morale stayed the same throughout. I fully understood what we were doing, and from the first day to the last to this day, I'm still motivated and my morale is high. I've only got a few days left in the Army after 27 years, and I feel like my mindset is still the same as it was when I joined up.
As we conducted more interviews, certain common themes emerged in many of the stories, which included the difficulty of maintaining friends and relationships back home during the deployment and beyond, navigating the challenges of life in a combat zone and its effects, dealing with the loss of colleagues, and the uncertainties of what it meant to come home. Today, we'll look at each of these themes and let you hear what the soldiers had to say about their experiences. In matters of a soldier's relationship with friends and family back home, it's clear from the veterans interviewed so far that nearly all of them have had difficulty in maintaining a connection with friends and sometimes even with family. This most personal expression of the military-civilian divide is something veterans attribute to a variety of factors. For many service folks with young families, one of the biggest problems was the extended absence of a parent, often at a time when they would most want to be at home to help their spouse or just to be a part of their children's lives. According to one soldier, the problems can be severe.
There's a lot of story of kids who lose that close connection with their parents and are real standoffish when they come back. It's because that was someone they depended on, and all of a sudden they were gone, and the kids are scared to let their guard down. Abandonment issues are a real problem. Even when you come back, there's a trust issue with your own kids. It's pretty heartbreaking.
This is not something we tend to think about, but in terms of sacrifice, parents giving up their families and all the implications of just not being there for their kids represent one of the most personal costs our servicemen and women have to pay, and one that often cuts the deepest. For others, the problems of maintaining relationships during and after deployment arose from insensitivity on the part of friends or family who sometimes asked inappropriate or insensitive questions, like, did you kill anyone? Or how are you dealing with PTSD? Others blamed themselves for shutting down to friends and family, noting an unwillingness to share details of their actions for fear of being viewed as a monster, or of saying something that might cause their loved ones to turn away. The dangers of opening up, even to, and sometimes especially to, those who are closest, makes the process of maintaining civilian relationships difficult in the extreme. A lack of communication often lies at the heart of this particular problem and is something that the VA acknowledges is one of the most challenging issues for the armed forces to deal with. The result in some cases was a complete breakdown of marriages and relationships which simply could not withstand the new set of conditions that were placed upon them during and after deployment. This is perhaps one of the more common and more tragic outcomes that we've heard in the interviews, and one that is also related to the difficulties of being away for many months at a time, often with limited opportunities to keep in touch the way that we at home take for granted. For one soldier, the family trauma was very real.
I took the last slot of R&R at the end of the deployment and went home to be promptly served with divorce papers. It was kind of a slap in the face, but I chalked it up to being deployed because we weren't talking very frequently. On that deployment, the communication was extremely difficult. We were able to use Yahoo Messenger, but the connection was slow and unreliable, so we had to rely on phone calls. I got to call home maybe once a week, but you frequently got cut off. In so many conversations, we'd be in the middle of discussing something important and it would just cut out. It took 10 to 15 minutes to get through, and there was a 20-minute time limit because everyone's waiting to use the phone. It was just an impossible situation.
In Afghanistan, communication problems could be worse due to the terrain and the isolation. Sergeant Nolan particularly felt the impact even while on the base at Kandahar.
I spent a lot of time traveling to various fire bases, and there was no communication back home. When I was on Kandahar, it was difficult because we had some type of bad phone or 5 to 6 seconds away, and we had to schedule calls. We had maybe 2 phones for the whole company. If you called during the regular day in Afghanistan, your spouse had to get up at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, so it was a little difficult. I did call home nearly enough for my wife's life that she managed to deal with it.
We might think that in this age of technology, communicating with home would be something the military had nailed down. And although it has improved in recent years, many problems still remain. Just imagine not seeing your family for 7, 8, 9 months or more, and hardly being able to talk with them during that time. For many of us, it's unthinkable. The constraints of communication and the tyranny of distance are time-worn problems, ones that veterans of all conflicts, foreign and domestic, can claim as a deeply personal burden of service. The struggle of balancing military and civilian lives often leaves scars that are less tangible than fractured relationships. The second theme to address, the effects of life in a combat zone relative to a person's physical and psychological health, can be hard to see and difficult to assess. The inability of servicemen and women to escape the pressures of their world on deployment, whether they're on the base or aboard a ship or out on a mission, is something that I think most civilians have a really hard time comprehending. There is no going home to switch off or decompress, no separation of work life and personal life, just the continual pressure of long work days in dangerous conditions endured for months on end. Something as simple as sleep, or the lack thereof, was named by many veterans as a serious threat to their well-being. Sergeant First Class Dustin Thompson, a 20-year Army veteran who served as an air traffic controller in Iraq, talked of the problem of winding down from deployment in a combat zone. When asked if he had trouble sleeping, here's what he had to say.
Not while I was there. Coming back is a different story, though. I'm not going to claim I have PTSD or anything, but there is a period of decompression after you get back stateside, where you have to wait for that hypervigilance to wear off. And then the insomnia can be borderline chronic. I mean, to this day, I have trouble sleeping at least twice a week. In country, you try to find a battle rhythm, a routine. The work days are just so long, 12 to 18 hours.
And the pressures are understandable considering Sergeant Thompson's job while on deployment. His busy airfield constantly came under mortar fire from insurgents, meaning that at any time, day or night, any minute of the day, he and his subordinates might have to dive for cover.
When we came under fire, I had to send everyone to the bunker. That was not only a challenge from receiving indirect fire, which was more accurate and closer than it had been, but we had 14 aircraft in the air, and all of them needed to be brought down immediately.
I think we can all agree that the job of an air traffic controller is complicated enough without the threat of being shot at. I mean, imagine in just about any job you can think of, the added weight of that pressure. The effects of being in a constant state of operational readiness while on deployment were a recurring theme in the interviews, and risk to life and limb was ever present, whether you were asleep in your barracks or engaged in a high-risk mission. The inherent danger of existing in a combat zone often made just doing your job a life-threatening experience. Staff Sergeant Laura Latson, who served as a medic in Iraq in 2007, recalled gearing up for her first mission. She donned a Red Cross patch on her arm, put a stethoscope around her neck, and placed instruments that she knew she would need into her chest pocket, until a fellow medic came up and told her to take it all off. The point was not to look like a medic, because medics, he said, were targeted by the enemy. It was a harsh reality to be faced with. The extent of the risks were also described by Command Sergeant Major Chad Lynch, who served in Afghanistan in 2002 and in Iraq in 2007 as part of the surge. As head of an engineering crew in Iraq, Sergeant Major Lynch was ordered to construct a concrete wall around a place called Sada City, which was a suburb of Baghdad, in order to cut off the flow of weapons that were coming to insurgents who were hiding in the town. The wall was to be capped by sniper screens. Now, these were angle iron uprights that had to be welded to the top of the concrete wall, as you see here, and between the uprights, a green sniper mesh would be suspended to try and block the view of potential snipers. And as you can see from the photograph, it's pretty well shot up. His explanation of how this was done highlighted the risks involved.
Overnight, we built a box to protect our soldiers who had to do the welding. The box would be suspended by crane about 30 feet above the wall, and this box was made of armor on 3 sides plus the floor and roof, but on one side was open. This was the side you had to work from. Then we hung soldiers inside the box to weld the steel struts for the screen. When the insurgents shot at the box constantly while the welders were in it, but they didn't flinch, they just kept working. Now that armor would handle bullets, but not an RPG, a rocket-propelled grenade. That would have taken them out. The general later showed up and pinned each of the welders with a Bronze Star with Valor. I mean, when you're willing to hang yourself up and get shot at to put a screen because the general told you to, it was important, you probably deserve to get some valor.
Indeed. Despite the vigilance, some did not fare as well. In such an environment, circumstances could turn deadly at a moment's notice. One young soldier working on the wall at Sada was lucky to survive, as Sergeant Major Lynch explained.
This kid was bent over hooking up chains to a piece of concrete wall because the crane was about to stand it up. Well, a sniper shot him through this backside. It came out through his leg, hit his groin protector, and flipped it up. The protector was Kevlar, and it returned the bullet back in the other direction, through his other leg. So he had an entrance and exit wound in each leg. That's 4 holes. He must have been 18 years old, this kid. Anyway, the colonel and I are so mad that one of our soldiers got shot, and we walk into the hospital room. We got there maybe 30 minutes after he did. His legs were both wrapped up in white tape, and he's sitting on the bed smiling. And I said, "Specialist, what are you smiling about?" He says, "That's a Purple Heart, and that's a combat action badge, Sergeant Major."
I don't know, maybe you have to be 18 years old to see the bright side of a situation like this. This young man was, remarkably, the only casualty in the construction of the wall at Sada City. So maybe it's fitting that in addition to his citations, his service, if not his name, has since been immortalized in the 2012 film American Sniper, something that this young soldier is pretty proud of, and rightly so. In Afghanistan, similar dangers were also mitigated by youth, as one veteran recalled.
We were about an hour and a half north of Bagram by Black Hawk. We were working for the 20th Group Special Forces at the time. It was a small FOB or forward operating base, not very big. We actually got hit with an RPG in the chow hall / chapel that we had just built. Thankfully, it was dark and no one was there. After the fact, I had learned that that was one of the hottest zones in Afghanistan at the time. That's where I earned my combat action badge. I knew it was a hot zone, but I just didn't realize, I guess being so young, I didn't realize how dangerous the situation was really there.
On top of fulfilling roles as combat soldiers, engineers, construction workers, mechanics, air traffic controllers, and dozens of other specialist jobs, today's veterans also have the added burden of being public relations experts in the Hearts and Minds campaigns that have represented a part of most recent wars. Contact with local populations, some of whom are war-ravaged victims, others are the enemy hiding in plain sight, brought its own strains and frustrations that came up in a number of the interviews. Soldiers with a mission to help civilians, many of whom were women and children, came up close and personal with the terrible destruction of lives and property wrought by local insurgents who were often residing among the civilian population. The difficulty of simply identifying the enemy created pressures of its own, uncertainties addressed by Sergeant Latson about her time in Iraq.
I ran into quite a few locals. They were interested in a female soldier, not in a negative way. There was this one young kid. He didn't know much English, and he couldn't have been but 15 years old. He just wanted to marry me. But then there was this experience I had with a local when this guy, a boy, threw a homemade IED into the back of a Humvee in our convoy. It was a dud. It didn't go off, but this kid was like 14. I don't know if he was threatened into doing it. The terrorists will sometimes threaten to kill their families if they don't, or if he just felt like that's what he should do, or he could have just been a stupid kid. You just never know.
Of the 2016-2017 campaign to reclaim Mosul from ISIS fighters, a veteran who chose to remain anonymous recalled the difficulties of reconciling problems of foreign civilians, combatants, and the role of the US military.
It was difficult to be in Mosul on the real estate that we'd carved out as a stronghold to make things better for the Iraqi people. And coming back 10 years later, it's in the enemy's hands and we're fighting the fight all over again. People's homes were destroyed, family members murdered. There was a tremendous amount of civilian displacement there and hardship. It was just awful. I mean, kids we met, their father was dead. Their brother and sister are trying to help their mom drag a little wagon with all their worldly possessions and in a way where the ISIS fighters are. There is a desperate attempt to survive. It's just really hard to see. And it seemed a little absurd fighting this turf all over again, but no one talked about it. There were a few peers, junior commissioned officers and senior NCOs, that we could talk openly about it. A lot of people felt the same way as I did. If you get some buy-in from people that you trust and respect, you think, well, maybe I'm not crazy.
This last statement addresses something that several veterans were willing to share: frustration over the nature and clarity of the mission. The protracted time frame of the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan has created something that is arguably unique to modern warfare, where objectives shift and priorities alter over time, leaving those on the ground to constantly reassess the value of their service. Veterans of Vietnam were perhaps the first en masse to have to deal with existential questions of purpose, morality, loyalty, and patriotism. Today, the issue is more universal, with asymmetrical warfare, insurgency and counterinsurgency being the norm, and something that further complicates the ability of some recent veterans to rationalize their service contribution and their actions in war zones. Such rationalizations become even harder for those who also have to carry the weight of having lost a fellow soldier in combat. The stories that we hear that address the loss of a colleague are, of course, the most difficult to bear witness to. Sergeant Major Lynch, at one point in his interview, quietly recalled a member of his team Sergeant Terrell Gilmore, who's pictured here on the right in this photograph, who paid the ultimate price for his service.
One of my soldiers ended up getting hit by an IED. He was driving a truck, just driving materials to another building site. The IED was just outside the base. He got hit and couldn't overcome his wounds.
In the tight-knit community of the base, this news was, of course, devastating, and it continues to be so for Sergeant Gilmore's family and for the families who've all lost a loved one on deployment, and even for those especially who were there, who lost a friend. Survivor's guilt and the tacit understanding that in other circumstances this might have been them presents a persistent and sometimes lifelong point of reckoning for veterans. Sergeant Latson also discussed the guilt associated with the sense of helplessness that many soldiers faced when it came to life and death situations. And this was something compounded by the nature of her job as a medic.
I lost a friend over there, and there's been a lot of survivor's guilt. I was on the 4th floor of this building, and there was an explosion. I mean, it shook the building. It was close. At first, I thought it was just a controlled detonation, and then I heard a second one and a third. The convoy had gotten ambushed right outside, and some of the injuries, I mean, unless you're a surgeon and can deal with it right there on the spot, there isn't much a medic can do. Since I've been back and have been trained as a paramedic, I realized we really weren't equipped to do much.
Other losses brought about not by the enemy, but by the pressure cooker conditions of deployment are no less devastating. For young people thrown into this environment, cut off from the support systems of home, the strains could be overwhelming. In today's military, one of the few outlets available to those on deployment is to go and talk to a chaplain. In addition to providing non-denominational church services, chaplains like Paige Brooks became crisis managers, sounding boards, and counselors for all those who were willing to talk. It is by any measure a tremendous burden to bear. Chaplain Brooks recalled one incident involving a young soldier at the base, a memory that has stuck with him over the years and remains raw.
And all of a sudden, I saw a lot of our senior enlisted running down one of the aisles that we had our CHUs, that's combat housing units, set up. Someone came up to me and said, "Chaplain, somebody popped themselves," which is a way of saying that he had shot themselves. And I remember coming up to that aisle and looking down the row of CHUs and seeing 2 of those sergeants finally get the door open, and then just the look on their faces, shaking their head at the scene.
Part of Chaplain Brooks's job also involved the heavy burden of notifying families of the loss of a son or daughter, husband or wife. When asked how he himself coped with such an emotionally draining job, he spoke of his faith and of the support of his family back home as sources of strength that allowed him to continue his duties day in, day out. It's clear from the stories relating to the sometimes deadly consequences of combat, whether those dangers are posed by the enemy or by the strains of the environment, that they leave deep scars on all who witness them. The last theme we'll address today, the experience of coming home, this drew varied responses from veterans. We've already discussed some of the problems associated with reassimilating into civilian life, although the issues presented today have just scratched the surface of the emotions that veterans have talked about on the subject of returning stateside. Disorientation, self-doubt, disconnectedness, and an inability to throw off that need for constant vigilance are just some of the problems that veterans have shared. For Sergeant Thompson, the experience of stepping off a commercial flight in Dallas-Fort Worth Airport sums up what many of the returning veterans felt. His reaction to the gathering of civilian greeters there to cheer the men and women in uniform as they came through security reflected the conflicting emotions that many have experienced.
There was a big crowd of greeters just clapping and applauding our return. I guess it made me feel pretty good about the effort I'd put in and what I was doing. I'm appreciative of that. Though I feel a little awkward at times, maybe I'm not most comfortable with receiving praise or thanks. In the back of my mind, there's that lingering thought that maybe they're just saying thank you for your service because they feel some kind of obligation to say it. But what's true for one person may not be true for another, so there's just no way to tell. I don't want people to feel like they have to place service members on a pedestal because we're not all the most noble, heroic people. I'm just a regular person doing my job.
This statement reflects the humility expressed by nearly all the servicemen and women who've contributed to the Veterans of Recent Wars project so far. But it also expresses a very personal experience of the military-civilian divide and the anxieties of coming home. Based on the reactions and the comments of those interviewed, it seems fair to suggest that the burden of care in helping bridge this divide lies with us in the civilian sphere. It's the duty not just of family, but of friends, of neighbors, and the community to reach out and offer not only our thanks, but to check in, to help out, and to open a channel of communication. Just starting a conversation with a veteran about anything is an act of kindness that builds trust over time. And then just be willing to listen, really listen. I think everyone in this room is aware of the high suicide rate among veterans today and of the struggle that many confront in gaining access to physical and mental health services, and of the growing problem, especially this year, of homelessness among veterans. And I don't think there's anyone here who doesn't feel outrage at seeing our vets in this state of crisis. But remember, we are the front line of the solution too. Southeastern is a registered military-friendly school. There are veterans and active duty military folks all over campus. So it's an easy place to start making a change in the way veterans right here in our school and in our local towns are made to feel like a valued part of the community whose sacrifice is appreciated. Veterans have done their part, and now it's time to do ours. To wrap up, we'd like to leave you with some final thoughts from Sergeant Standridge, this time in his own words.
Several of the issues that Dr. Sam has addressed today are universal. An additional thought that I would like to add to this is how veterans create a limited reality of the environment that they're in. In my experience, it wasn't as grim as a kill or be killed scenario, although there are many that were faced with that line in the sand. It was just going inward and just being with the people that you're with, and that's it. You isolate yourself from the reality of everything in hopes that you can do your duty and do your job to the best of your ability, in hopes that you and your comrades can go home. And it paid a huge toll on families and the soldiers, although they didn't know it at the time. And as this wasn't military training, there was no textbook answer of how to fix it. And everyone did it individually without speaking to each other. In 2007, when we got there, there was a little plywood building with some phones to call home. And like when we first arrived there, the line was 2-3 hours long. And you only had little 15-minute blocks to talk. And just as time went on, the line got shorter and shorter, and then towards the end of the deployment, there wasn't a line at all. You could pretty much go anytime you wanted and call home. And even to this day, I have a very hard time caring about anything. Like sports statistics, all around me, people will be discussing that, and I'll even find myself getting angry. Like, how can you care about something as small as this when there's real problems in the world? And it's been 10 years since I've been in a combat environment, and I still haven't been able to turn that off. This veterans program that Dr. Sam has started is one of the few things to light a fire in me in a very long time, and I would encourage all of you to become become involved in the program. It's an incredible resource, and it's a great outlook.
Thanks, Cody. If you know any veterans who would like to participate in the Veterans of Recent Wars project and be interviewed for the archive, or if you'd just like to know more about the project, you can contact me at this email address. My thanks to Sergeant Standridge and Colonel Carter for being here to voice the veteran stories that you've heard today, and also thank you for your service to us all. And please take a minute on this Veterans Day to just think about what you can do to help, as a volunteer for a veterans organization or just by reaching out as a friend. You can and you will make a difference. Thank you.